Stitching section. The stitching section is one of the decisive sections either of the production, either of the quality of the company. It is one of the sections where one notices more and more the changes of styles because it forces to the alteration of the type of operations to execute and of the sequence of the same ones. The diversity of operations to execute and its larger or smaller complexity degree have a high impact in time of the styles. The constant evolution of the stitching section, either at organizational level as technician, is therefore fundamental for a high productivity. The objective of the stitching section is to make the junction and/or the union of the previously cutted pieces in the cutting section in order to obtain the upper, that it is the superior part of the shoe. The stitching is usually preceded of a group of operations, designated as stitching preparation, that has as objective to prepare the cutted pieces to be stitched. Operations of the stitching preparation section. Here we present some of the main pre-stitching operations, being of pointing out that depending on the organization of each company, they can be integrated in the cutting section or in the stitching section, or they can constitute an autonomous section. In the pre-stitching section, it is executed a group of operations that have as objective to prepare the cutted pieces to be stitched. We can refer the following operations: to scratch out pieces, splitting, skiving, to fold, to crimp, to stiffen, to mark. To scratch out pieces, demarcations for the stitching. It is usually necessary to scratch out or to mark the pieces, as orientation for the stitching operators as for the correct positioning of the pieces to stitch. Several methods exist for making this operation that can be used to position stitchings overlapping, eyelets, dashes, etc. This operation can be accomplished manually after the cut of the pieces or in simultaneous with the cutting operation, if the cutting dies are prepared for the effect as it is described following. To scratch out manual. Identical molds to those of the cutting are used, but with the openings in the positions that need to be marked. These openings can be to do scratch out or to mark stings. Each mold is placed on a respective piece and the mark is made with an own pen. Demarcation of the cutting dies. Both the risks and the stings can be included in the cutting dies, and like this obtain the demarcations simultaneous with the cutting of the piece. However, there is to refer that nor it is always viable the inclusion of the profiles and the pricks in the cutting dies, either due to the relationship cost-benefit, either due to the used materials that force that these have to be scratched out. Splitting operation. This operation intends to uniformize the thickness of the skin pieces, reducing it until a certain intended value. There are in the market several splitting machines. Patterns can be used in this system, which are pieces with the configuration of the piece or parts of the piece that remove thickness in a certain area and not in the totality of the piece. Skiving operation. The skiving operation has as objective to reduce the thickness of a certain extremity of pieces in a way to improve the appearance of the shoe, to avoid discomfort during the use, to reduce overlapping and to prepare the pieces for certain operations. The width, thickness and angle of the skiving are determined in agreement with the material type, work that we intend to accomplish and still with the effect that we intend to obtain. Therefore, there exist several skiving types, being the more used, skiving to border, the overlapping skive of pieces, the skiving of union of the pieces and the skiving of the assembly margin. Folding operation. When folding is mechanically made, the glue flow should be verified to be regular so that the folding is uniform. In relation to the execution proceeding of the operation, the hand that holds and drives the piece should make it in a way that the board of the piece to fold is always leaner to the guide of thickness, never arresting it and letting it to slide under the fingers. We can also incorporate a reinforcement tape in order to increase the resistance of the folding. In the pieces in which the boards are of concave configuration, these could be hit in simultaneous with the folding operation, owing the machine, in these cases, to possess the system of heating the pieces and being necessary to drive the heating razor in the course of the concavity. For the convex boards it is not necessary the heating razor. After the fold of the board, the perimeter of this is larger than the necessary. Like this, smaller pleats are formed that compensate the material in excess. Crimping operation. With this operation we intend to obtain a given curvature in the pieces in order to obtain a good assembly. The obtaining of a satisfactory crimping curvature varies considerably from material to another, being advisable the accomplishment of preliminary rehearsals in order to determine the temperature at the most appropriate time. This operation is very used in lady styles, but also in other kinds of shoes. There is a great number of available machines, although all of them have the same operation basically. In other words, the upper is placed well centered on a plate, the machine is driven, lowering another plate that will crimp the upper. The curvature that the upper will have depends on the style. The quality of the work depends on the type of material, temperature of the machine and time of molding. Stiffing operation. With this operation we intend to reinforce some pieces to contradict the excessive distension of some skins or when to expand skins too thin, avoiding like this bursts during its assembly on the last. There are several types of buckrams, being however the most used the thermoadhesive screen textile. It is usually applied in own equipment through the heat and pressure. The buckram correctly applied should not be larger than the piece in skin and it should be correctly centered on the skin piece. Marking operation. This operation is usually executed in the counterpart or in the pole, having the objective to identify the product. By norm, the most used identification is the size registration, style number and production order. Stitching equipments. In the stitching section there are used several equipments that allow the junction of pieces. Following are presented some of the equipments that one can find in the stitching section. Post-bed stitching machine of 1 needle. Post-bed stitching machine of 2 needles. Arm piping stitching machine. Zigzag stitching machine. Seam bitting machine. Seam pressing and tapping machine. Post-bed stitching machine of 1 needle. This equipment is used in the execution of junction operations and overlapping of pieces. The post-bed machine of 1 needle is very used because it allows to execute operations already with the upper closed. In this equipment type we can find machines equipped with different devices, namely thread cut, gallant, finishing off. Apart the effort, in this equipment type we also have machines that make operations with different types of thread thickness. Post-bed stitching machine of 2 needles. These machines are used to execute operations in that there is the need of making parallel seams. With this machine, it is possible to make a parallel seam to the other, always maintaining the same distance and guaranteeing the product quality. Arm piping stitching machine. This equipment type possesses an arm in the horizontal that facilitates the execution of operations when the upper is already closed. In this equipment type we can include the piping machines, which have as function the application of a piping that can be synthetic or in skin. Zigzag machine. The zigzag machine is used in most cases for the execution of junctions of linings and pieces in skin that stay hidden. However, there are cases in that the zigzag is used as decoration. Seam bitting machine. This equipment is used to reboot seams and pieces overlapping that have high thickness, and the execution of this operation has as objective to reduce that thickness in order to reduce the difficulty in the stitching process and to avoid incorrections in the stitching. Seam pressing and tapping machine. It is a combined equipment, in other words, executes the operation of opening seams and in simultaneous it applies reinforcement tape. This equipment is used to open the seams of the junctions of the pieces and to make its reinforcement with the application of the tape on those junctions. Reinforcement tapes. Nowadays in the shoe industry are used more and more the reinforcement tapes. Why? They implement a better quality. They improve the shape and the aspect of the shoe. They reduce the costs of the company. They increase the duration of the shoe. The reinforcement tapes are placed in different points of the upper. In the back seams to turn them more resistant and more straightened. The assembly becomes simpler and its quality improves. The reinforcement tapes should be resistant. They should possess enough elasticity to maintain the shoe sealed to the foot. They should have flexibility to accompany the curvature of the piece, and they should possess a thin thickness so that the piece doesn't get thick, turning the tape visible. to apply glue and cement pieces. This operation has as purpose to previously point the pieces before proceeding to their stitching. This operation should only be made if the degree of difficulty for the stitching is high. Whenever possible, an unilateral glue should be used in order to reduce the execution time of the operation. Stitching types. The objective of the stitching is to proceed to the union of the cutting pieces. In the execution of this union, it is usual to use the stitching because this offers a larger durability, a part serving as decoration. Following are presented several stitching types used either for union of pieces, either decorative. Union stitching or junction. The pieces are placed right with right and it is made the stitching uniting the pieces. Usually this operation type is made in the junctions of the legs of the boots and in the junctions of the back counters and or the counterparts. Overlapping stitching. The pieces are placed one on the other and it is made the stitching uniting the pieces. This operation type is made when there is the need of overlapping the pieces, as for instance, to sew the back part of the upper. Zigzag stitching. The pieces are lineared board with board and it is made to the union stitching in zigzag. This stitching type is more used in union of linings or even of pieces. However, these will be later hidden. In rarer cases, the zigzag is used as ornament stitching. Ornament or decoration stitching. It is the stitching done just to ornament on the drawing scratched out in the upper. Usually the lines are thicker to point out the ornament. Manual stitching. It is used in the tubular shoes to sew the vamp to the upper. There are several seam types and usually the pieces are holed for us to pass the needle and thread. The thread should be thick and resistant. In the operations of union of the pieces made through the seam, the distance of the seam to the board of the skin is very important, as much in the performance of the seam as in the final appearance of the shoe, above all in the overlapping of pieces, in that the board is visible after the shoe is executed. A very small distance of the seam to the board of the skin can bring problems, in a measure in that in certain points the seam can even leave the skin board out. Trimming operation. The stitching machine itself might have incorporated a razor that trims the excess of material in simultaneous with the execution of the seam, stitching and trimming machines. In this case, there is the reduction of the time of process because later there is no need for the execution of a supplemental operation. However, not always this method is applicable, because the material to trim cannot be too thin and the margin cannot be very narrow to make possible the fitting in the razor. Final stitching operations. Here are presented some operations that usually are accomplished in the end of the stitching section, although they can, in specific styles, be made before the end. Perforation operation. This operation is made to perforate the skin. It is executed separately and or in simultaneous with the operation of putting staples, eyelets and strainers. Asides what was referred, this operation can be made manually using a puncher. Placing eyelets and strainers. In the laces shoes it is accomplished by norm the operation of placing eyelets. It is an operation mechanically done that consists on the fixation of the eyelets in the shoe. Either the quantity, either the diameter or format of the eyelet, they can vary from style to style.